In 1923, the German mark was so worthless that families burned stacks of banknotes just to keep warm. Workers were paid twice a day because, by afternoon, their morning wages could not buy a loaf of bread. Children made kites out of money. Stories circulated of money being used for everyday crafts because it had lost so much value. Restaurant prices rose while customers were still eating. A man could order a cup of coffee and watch the price double before it arrived at his table. That was Germany. Now look at September 1939. More than 1.5 million German soldiers, backed by thousands of tanks and warplanes, storm across the Polish border in the largest military invasion Europe has ever seen. The German army, just 6 years earlier, had been limited by treaty to 100,000 men with no tanks, no warplanes, and no heavy weapons. In little more than a decade, a nation under severe strain built one of Europe's most powerful militaries. And the question no one asks often enough is simple. How did they pay for it? The answer involves a fake company with no employees, a financial genius who nearly stopped it all, and a ticking time bomb hidden inside Germany's own banking system. A dummy company helped finance one of the era's most aggressive rearmament drives, mostly off the official books. And the bills come due in 1939, the same year that Germany does not have the money to pay them back. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how Germany funded its massive military with no money, why the Nazi economy made war not just possible, but inevitable, and why the man who designed the entire system eventually tried to shut it down. If you find this story interesting, consider subscribing. We cover stories like this every week. Here is the situation. Germany has been economically destroyed, not once, but twice in just 14 years. The first disaster came in 1923. After the First World War, the Allied powers demanded enormous payments from Germany. These payments were called reparations. That is, money a defeated country must pay to cover the damage caused by war. The original bill was staggering, 132 billion gold marks, set in May 1921. Germany struggled from the start. When it fell behind on payments in early 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. It was humiliation on top of hardship. The German government responded by telling workers to resist, to refuse cooperation with the occupiers. But those striking workers still needed to be paid. So the government printed money, enormous amounts of money. Within months, the currency collapsed. In late 1923, everyday prices like bread rose from ordinary amounts to staggering figures in a short time. By late 1923, the exchange rate had reached trillions of marks per US dollar. Shops changed their prices by the hour. Workers rushed out during lunch breaks to spend their morning wages because by evening those wages would be worthless. Families who had spent lifetimes building modest savings watched those savings vanish in weeks. Life insurance policies became worthless. Pensions became worthless. The middle class, which had been the backbone of German society, was financially destroyed. People used banknotes as wallpaper because it was cheaper than buying actual wallpaper. The crisis was eventually brought under control with a new currency called the Rentenmark, introduced in November 1923, and a few years of fragile recovery followed. American loans flowed into Germany under a plan called the Dawes Plan. Factories reopened. Employment improved. For a brief window, it seemed like Germany might recover. Then came the second blow. In October 1929, the American stock market crashed, and the Great Depression spread across the globe. Germany was hit harder than almost any other country in Europe because its economy depended heavily on those American loans that had been propping it up since 1924. When American banks called the loans back, the entire system crumbled. Banks failed. Credit froze. Factories shut down. By 1932, around 6 million Germans were unemployed, close to a third of the labor force at the peak. The German unemployment insurance system, designed to handle about 1.4 million people, buckled completely. Families sold their furniture on street corners. Soup kitchens stretched across city blocks. Hunger and malnutrition worsened, and many families faced serious health hardship. Political violence erupted in the streets as communists and far-right groups fought pitched battles. So Germany has been broken twice. No money, no army, no hope. And into that desperation steps Adolf Hitler, who promises to rebuild everything in secret. Hitler was appointed Chancellor on January 30th, 1933. He inherited a nation with massive unemployment, a shattered currency, and a military limited by the Treaty of Versailles to just 100,000 soldiers with no tanks, no military aircraft, and no heavy artillery. He wanted to do something that seemed impossible. He wanted to build the largest military force in Europe, and he wanted to do it without triggering inflation, without borrowing from foreign banks that might alert other governments, and without the rest of the world finding out. For this job, he turned to one man. His name was Hjalmar Schacht. He was a banker, not a soldier. Born in 1877, Schacht had already saved the German economy once before. Back in 1923, he had played a key role in stabilizing the currency during the hyperinflation crisis. He understood German finance better than almost anyone alive. In March 1933, just weeks after Hitler took power, Schacht was reappointed as president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank. By August 1934, he was also serving as Minister of Economics. He effectively controlled both the nation's money supply and its economic policy. His challenge was enormous: fund a massive secret military buildup, do it without raising taxes to a level that would provoke unrest, do it without printing so much money that inflation returns, and do it without leaving a paper trail that foreign governments or the international press could follow. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forbidden from rearming. The spending had to be invisible. Here is how he did it. In May 1933, Schacht created a company. On paper, it looked completely real. It had a proper name, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, which translates to Metallurgical Research Corporation. Everyone called it Mefo for short. It had an address, a bank account, and even a board of directors. Major firms backed Mefo with a small nominal capital, often cited around 1 million Reichsmarks, because the company's real purpose was financial, not industrial. It was a modest sum for what would become the financial engine of the entire German rearmament. But here is the key. Mefo did not make anything. It did not sell anything. It had no factory floor, no products, no employees doing actual work. It existed for one purpose only: to issue bills of exchange. A bill of exchange is a written promise to pay a certain amount of money at a future date. Think of it like a government check that you cannot cash right away. It is an IOU with a countdown. Now imagine you're a German arms manufacturer in 1935. The government comes to you and says, "Build us tanks." You say, "Fine, but how will I be paid?" They do not hand you cash. Instead, they hand you a piece of paper, a Mefo bill, drawn on this shell company. You take that bill to your local bank. The bank gives you cash for it because the bank knows it can take that same bill to the Reichsbank, the central bank, and the Reichsbank will honor it. The Reichsbank accepts the bill because the German government has secretly guaranteed it. Everybody gets paid, tanks get built, and none of it shows up on the official government budget. This was critical because at the time, German law prohibited the Reichsbank from lending the government more than 100 million Reichsmarks directly. Mefo bills allowed billions to flow through a back door. The financial architect himself later admitted at the Nuremberg trials that the whole system was, in his words, a subterfuge that let the central bank do what it could not legally do. The bills were originally written with a 6-month maturity, meaning they were supposed to be paid back in 6 months. But the government kept extending them in 90-day increments, and eventually the effective maturity stretched to 5 years. To make the bills attractive to hold, they carried a high interest rate, often cited around 4 to 5%, and could be rolled over repeatedly. Banks were content to hold them. They did not rush to cash them in. The money kept flowing and the arms kept being built. Here's the key point. Between 1934 and April 1938, when the program was finally discontinued, Germany secretly issued roughly 12 billion Reichsmarks in Mefo bills. To put that in perspective, Germany's entire official national debt in 1932, the year before Hitler took power, was about 10 billion Reichsmarks. So through this one scheme alone, Germany had added more in hidden debt than the entire national debt that existed before the Nazi era began. Mefo Bills financed roughly 60% of all gross military spending during those years, and nobody outside Germany knew. Now watch what happens. The Mefo Bills worked almost too well. The Nazi economy grew at a remarkable pace through the mid-1930s, with annual growth rates estimated between 8 and 10%. Unemployment plummeted. Factories hummed. Germany secretly built warplanes, tanks, submarines, and trained hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But there was a fatal flaw built into the design, and it was the same flaw that sits at the heart of every scheme built on borrowed time. By 1939, the earliest bills were reaching their 5-year limit, and the repayment problem could no longer be postponed. Think of it this way. The financial architect had created what amounted to a massive, hidden line of credit with a 5-year deadline. The first major bills were issued in 1934. That means by 1939, holders would start showing up at the Reichsbank's door, demanding real money. If the Reichsbank could not pay, the entire system would be exposed. Confidence would collapse. Inflation, a nightmare Germany had already survived once, would come roaring back. In modern terms, it resembled a rollover debt system. It depended on extending promises forward until real repayment became unavoidable. By late 1937, Schacht, the architect of the system, could see the wall approaching. He urged Hitler to slow down military spending. He argued that the economy had reached full employment, that price pressures were building, and that continuing to spend at this pace would end in disaster. Hitler did not want to hear it. In November 1937, the financial architect resigned as Minister of Economics. He stayed on as Reichsbank president, but the friction continued to build. In late 1938, he tried to sell long-term bonds to the public to cover the coming shortfall. The first few packages sold. The last one failed spectacularly. The money simply was not there. On January 7, 1939, Schacht and all 8 directors of the Reichsbank submitted a blunt written warning directly to Hitler. It urged drastic cuts to military spending and warned, in their words, against an assault on the currency. 13 days later, on January 20, 1939, Hitler fired him. So the man who built the system is fired for saying it is about to collapse. And Hitler's solution? Keep conquering. This brings us to the darker machinery that kept the Nazi economy running once the Mefo scheme ran its course. The bills stopped being issued in April 1938, but Germany's appetite for money only grew. And from this point forward, every source of revenue the regime relied on came from taking from someone else. Start with conquest. When Germany absorbed Austria in March 1938, it seized the Austrian National Bank's gold and foreign currency reserves. When it took the Sudetenland later that year and then occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, it looted those countries' reserves and industrial capacity too. Each conquest fed the machine with new assets, buying a little more time before the debts came crashing down. Then came the occupation payments. After France fell in June 1940, the armistice signed on June 22nd required France to pay the cost of its own occupation by German forces. Germany set those costs at 400 million French francs per day. That was an enormous sum, made even more exploitative by an exchange rate that Germany had rigged heavily in its own favor, pegging 1 Reichsmark to 20 francs, roughly 4 times the pre-war rate. Researchers at the National Bureau of Economic Research have estimated that nearly 20% of France's entire economic output was transferred to Germany in the first partial year of occupation. Alone, the transfer rose to well over a third of French output in the years that followed. France was effectively funding the German war machine that had conquered it, and the French were not alone. Similar extractions were imposed on Belgium, the Netherlands, and other occupied nations. Then there was the use of forced labor. Millions of people from occupied countries, including prisoners of war, civilians rounded up from conquered territories, and concentration camp inmates were compelled to work in German factories, farms, and mines. By the later years of the war, forced laborers made up a significant portion of the German workforce, and conditions were often lethal. At Volkswagen's main plant, forced laborers made up a large share of the workforce. Estimates vary by year and definition, but it was a majority in key periods. And then there was the Volkswagen scheme itself. In the summer of 1938, the Nazi government launched a savings program for ordinary German workers. The idea was simple and appealing. Pay 5 Reichsmarks a week into a special account, collect stamps in a savings booklet, and eventually you would receive a brand new car, the so-called Strength Through Joy car, or KDF wagon, priced at 990 Reichsmarks. It was the car that would later become the world-famous Volkswagen Beetle. About 336,000 Germans signed up. Hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks were collected. The factory was built. How many civilian cars were delivered to those savers? 0, not one. The factory was converted to military production. The money was absorbed into the war economy. The workers never got their cars. Every revenue stream the Nazi economy depended on required taking from someone else. None of it was sustainable. By 1939, Germany's economy was overheating. Inflation was creeping back. The Mefo Bills were coming due. The hidden debts were stacking up. And here's where the economic story and the military story become inseparable. Many historians, including the economic historian Adam Tooze in his landmark study of the Nazi economy, have argued that by the late 1930s, the German economic machine had created a situation where standing still was no longer an option. The debts demanded expansion. The military demanded resources. The factories demanded raw materials that Germany simply did not have. Germany lacked oil. It lacked rubber. It lacked many of the critical minerals needed to keep the war machine running. Historians debate motives, but many argue economic pressures and resource constraints were among the factors shaping the timing and scale of war. The system the financial architect had built demanded growth, demanded new assets, demanded new sources of plunder to keep the debts at bay. And when the conquest of Western Europe in 1940 still did not solve the fundamental resource shortages, the regime looked east. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa, was driven in significant part by the desperate need for oil from the Caucasus and grain from Ukraine. As Tooze has argued, the economic logic of the war drove Germany toward Barbarossa. Hitler needed to seize the natural resources necessary to sustain a long war against Britain and eventually the United States. Two economic superpowers whose combined industrial output Germany could not hope to match over time. The war was the economy. The economy was at war. So let us zoom out. How did a bankrupt nation pay for the largest military buildup in European history? The answer has 4 parts. First, creating counting. The Mefo Bills allowed Germany to spend far beyond its means while keeping the debt hidden from its own citizens, from the banking system, and from the outside world. This bought years of time, but it also created a financial time bomb with a fuse that ran out in 1939. Second, plunder. Each conquest, from Austria to Czechoslovakia to Poland to France and beyond, brought new assets, gold reserves, foreign currency, factories, raw materials, and tax bases that could be drained to feed the system. Third, forced labor. Millions of people from across occupied Europe were compelled to work for the German war effort under conditions that amounted to industrial slavery. Their unpaid labor was a massive hidden subsidy to the German economy. Fourth, theft from its own citizens. Programs like the Volkswagen savings scheme extracted money from ordinary Germans under false promises, while wages were held down and domestic consumption was suppressed to free up resources for the military. It was a high-risk system built on hidden debt, rollovers, and extraction, one that became harder to sustain without continued expansion. Like any such scheme, it could only survive as long as new money, new conquests, and new victims kept flowing in. The moment the conquest stopped, the moment the military suffered defeats it could not reverse, the entire structure began to collapse. The pyramid falls when there is nothing left to take. Remember those 2 snapshots we started with. In 923, a nation burned its own money for warmth. 16 years later, that same nation fields the most powerful army Europe has ever seen. The system that made it possible was brilliant in its design and catastrophic in its consequences. It was built by a financial architect who understood exactly what he had created and who tried, too late, to stop it. When Hjalmar Schacht warned Hitler in January 1939 that the system could not hold, he was dismissed. And the machine kept running, powered not by wealth but by debt, deception, and destruction, until there was nothing left to destroy but itself.